We are commencing our lecture series on the theory of evolution, and this topic is extensive. It's like a 10-headed beast that has a lot of different disciplines that speak into it. A lot of people are stakeholders in this topic because this topic gets to the very heart of why we are here, where everything came from, what is our purpose in life. A lot of those deep questions stem from the considerations of the theory of evolution. And it's not by any means just strictly for the biologist to talk about evolution, because there's a lot of different factors here. There's a lot of different disciplines that weigh into things like how old the earth is and how life could arise under certain conditions and so forth. There's a lot of philosophical implications here. There's theological implications here. So very, very elaborate, entangled tapestry of ideas and concepts to sort through. So it's oftentimes difficult to figure out where to even begin. And I like to start off in a little bit of an unusual place. I start off making mention of this gentleman. So this gentleman is George Udny Yule, and he is a Scottish scientist. And this is riding on the heels of Gregor Mendel's time. So late 1800s. Gregor Mendel was, about mid 1800s. And Gregor Mendel studying why it is that we have the traits that we have. How is it that one living thing could pass on its traits to another living thing, which was really of extraordinary interest for people, because again, getting to the root of, how are we the way that we are? It's an important question. And specifically, Yule is going to dispute the findings of Mendel because he can't figure out why dominant alleles don't take over a population. So Mendel has just shown that it's more likely for an organism to have a dominant phenotype than a recessive phenotype, given the fact that the heterozygous genotype would yield a dominant phenotype. That's kind of a mouthful. And so in either case, he's not entirely sold on some of the new findings of Mendel. And Reginald Punnett is going to disagree with Yule. He does support Mendel's new discoveries in the field of genetics. And the problem is that he can't figure out how to counter Yule. He doesn't know. He thinks Yule is not correct, and he thinks that Mendel's ideas were correct, but he can't figure out why Yule is incorrect. He can't figure out the mathematical notations and logic pathways to disprove the notion that dominant alleles will take over in a population if given enough time. So he sets this quandary to a couple of his fellow scientists. Nobody can also figure out the answer of why Yule is incorrect. And then eventually he's playing cricket with this gentleman, G.H. Hardy, who is not even a biologist at all, but a mathematician. And he presents the conundrum to G.H. Hardy. G.H. Hardy sits down, puts a pen to the paper, and within a few moments, I imagine, has figured out the riddle. And so he actually takes it upon himself to write to the editor of a science publication. And look at this snarky remark. Okay, I love this little snark here. I'm reluctant to intrude in discussion concerning matters of which I have no expert knowledge. I should have expected that the very simple point I wish to make would have been familiar to biologists. However, it makes it seem like that's not the case. So he's basically saying that you guys should all have this figured out by now. I can't even believe that I'm the one figuring this out right now. Which goes to show you, not all biologists are very savvy mathematicians, okay? And and I sure resonate with that sentiment over the past things that have happened these past few years. Okay, so he goes on to put forth the mathematical rationale here for why it is the case that dominant alleles don't take over in a population. And so basically he's making mention of the three possibilities: homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and homozygous recessive, being in ratio 1:1. And given the allele frequencies of these alleles in the population, so basically what percentage of the population has a dominant allele, what percentage of the population has a recessive allele, If you do the math, it ends up being a ratio something like this, and this is much more complex than I'm ever going to ask you to know in this class. But basically, the long and short of it is that it suggests that whatever the values of P, Q, and R are, so these are the allele frequencies in a population, how abundant the alleles are in a population, that the distribution will remain unchanged after the second generation. So he's showing in a mathematical way why it is the case that dominant alleles don't take over a population. Okay, coincidentally, this is a finding that was also discovered by a German thinker, Wilhelm Weinberg, or Wilhelm Weinberg, and interestingly, he actually came up with this idea before Hardy, but he wrote in German, and German wasn't as universal of a language as English was at the time, and so most of his ideas basically stayed in Germany because most people didn't speak German outside of Germany, whereas more people spoke English outside of Britain. So his ideas were long forgotten and long lost until like in the 40s, somebody came across his ideas and said, wow, that's actually the same thing that Hardy had come up with, and he actually figured it out a couple months prior and never got the credit. So now we collectively call their findings the Hardy-Weinberg principle, and in summary, their principle is this: allele frequencies do not change in a population unless they are disrupted. Okay, so when we say allele frequency, we basically mean like if you were to consider all the people in the world as a big gene pool, each having two alleles, one from mom, one from dad, for any particular trait, then the allele frequencies would be like the total number of all the dominant alleles versus the total number of all the recessive alleles in the population. That allele frequency should not change. So in other words, if there's an island where there's 70% of the people have brown eyes and 30% of the people have blue eyes, if you get in a time machine and travel away and come back 100 generations later, there should still be 70% of the people that have brown eyes and 30% of the people that have blue eyes, just out of the distribution of the genes, the alleles in the allele pool, and the way that they are randomly mixed around in the population. Now, interestingly then, there are exceptions to this rule. There are reasons that cause this not to be the case. In other words, there are reasons that allele frequencies actually do change in a population despite what Hardy and Weinberg had shown. And this was of particular interest because in theory it is actually these various conditions, which we call disruptions, which will change allele frequencies, and it's then these very disruptions which would be the things that are causing evolution to occur, theoretically. Okay, so it opened the door to a more detailed investigation into the various things that might cause populations to change their frequency of alleles and thereby evolve. In order for any population, in theory, to evolve, it does have to be subjected to a change in allele frequencies. There have to be traits that are becoming more and more common and other traits that are becoming less and less common, right? So it is the study of the disruptions which then piqued the interest of the evolutionists. So the way that I like to then frame up this whole theory of evolution is the following. I like to break it into two observations. Observation one, that there are various disruptions that can happen in a population which will alter the allele frequencies in that population throughout the generations, from generation to generation and generation. Various disruptions, if they are present, will make it so that the frequency of allele in a population is changing as the population continues to reproduce and new generations come on the scene. Now, the various disruptions that there are, here's a few of them. This isn't an exhaustive list, but some of them would be like non-random mating. So think about that island analogy, the brown eye, blue eye. If one of those traits, either brown eyes or blue eyes, one of those alleles was more attractive for whatever reason than perhaps more people would find mates of that particular eye color, and then that would lead to a change in the allele frequency. One of those alleles would become more common and the other one would become less common. So that happens if there's non-random mating. Mutations can come into the scene and introduce new alleles into a population. So it's thought that red hair, anybody that has red hair, has incurred there. That was a mutation that caused that allele. That allele didn't used to exist, and then the mutation brought that allele into the population. And then there are some other ones here which we'll talk about later. All of these can be acted upon by this process known as natural selection, which is itself also a disruption because it will pull certain alleles out of a population over time, or it will select which traits become more and more abundant and which ones become least abundant. That sort of thing. Okay, so that's observation 1. Now, this process would be called microevolution. All of the disruptions, changing the allele frequencies, and regardless of where you stand on this issue, whether you are highly against the notion of any kind of evolution, or if you feel like evolution is a very scientific theory that's credible, regardless of where you land, I would hope that you'd consider the validity of microevolution. This is something that I think would be very hard to dispute. It's easy to observe this in real time in a population, right? We're even going to simulate this in a lab that we do. You could see this even in something as simple as dog breeding, right? You take a golden retriever and a poodle, you breed them together, and you have a golden doodle. You've just come up with some alleles that are more or less frequent in that golden doodle, and then you breed up a population of golden doodles, and now you have a whole population of dogs, which are all the same technically species, but there's a change in the amount of alleles. Whatever allele comes onto the scene when you cross a golden retriever and a poodle, now that allele is becoming more and more abundant. That's what we'd call microevolution, and I don't think there's really anything controversial or contentious about the churnings and the process of microevolution. Okay, observation 2 then is that there are a lot of different species in the world. I mean, the variety of species we have on this planet is astounding. So then the question, which lies a little bit more outside the realm of hard science, it lies outside the realm of hypothesis testing, which is why I'm not including it in one of these circles, is the following. What is the relationship between the diversity of species that we see today and the churnings of microevolution? To what extent have all of the species that we observe today, to what extent has microevolution wrought all of that diversity? That is a very important question, and that is a much more contentious question. It's a little bit more of a philosophical question. Nobody can really put an experiment together to watch many different species being formed from microevolution, right? So it's not ever really going to be subject to the rigors of the scientific method. We can't hypothesis test it. We can't really even do much. I mean, some correlation data maybe, but this is a much more philosophical question. Now, this process then would be called macroevolution, or sometimes it's given the word speciation. So if you are somebody that feels uneasy about the theory of evolution, what you probably feel more uneasy about is this, speciation. I would encourage you to not feel uneasy here about microevolution, okay? And some of these words that we usually associate with being a position held by people who espouse this ideology of all the diversity of species coming from macroevolution. So keep that in the back of your mind. It's a good, I think, framework to consider as we're navigating the labyrinth here of all the different concepts associated with the theory of evolution. I just want you to have a pretty good idea of when we're existing inside of this circle and when we're existing inside of this circle, and then also a pretty good idea of when we start to jump out of the realms of hypothesis testing and we get a little bit more philosophical. Okay. I think if you keep that in the back of your mind, it'll help you out as you navigate this topic. Okay, so one of the most iconoclastic, quintessential, gargantuan, extraordinarily significant questions you can ask is, how old is the Earth? How old is the Earth? If the Earth is young, then this is just simply not possible. There's not enough time for this to occur given the pace in theory that it might be happening now. Okay, in order for this to occur, there has to be many years, millions and millions of years. If it's not that old, the Earth, then this is not even an option to us. So age has huge significance here, and that's why I think it's a really good place to start. We do have to wrestle a little bit with the age of the Earth before we can proceed any further here, because if it shows that the Earth is in fact young, then we don't really have to worry about any of this. If it does show in fact that the Earth is old, then this is a little bit more of an option to us. Okay, and I'm just going to give you a little spoiler alert here. You're not going to probably get the clarity that you're hoping for in this question. I've studied this for many years, and generally I get really excited about it. I start doing some research. I find some convincing arguments either way for young versus old, and then I get worn out, and then I leave still undecided. Okay, so if I've been still uncertain about where my position is here on the age of the Earth after 15 years, then I would encourage you to feel okay about also being undecided by the end of this lecture series. Okay, one gentleman who tried to figure out the age of the Earth was the Comte de Buffon. This was back in the 1700s. He was a French count, and it was said of him that he only asked women to help him with his experiments because naturally their hands were more sensitive for measuring. Okay, so the Comte de Buffon, with the help of his sensitive ladies' hands, they take a molten ball of iron out of the foundry that was at his estate, or nearby his estate, and they watched as it cooled. The idea is that he thought that the Earth was also basically a molten ball of iron at some point in time, and it cooled, and so based upon how long it would take a small red-hot ball of iron to cool, you could extrapolate that out to the size and scale of the Earth to figure out how old the Earth must be to cool. So a very simple experiment, and I some days long for the days when experiments were this simple. Not quite so simple anymore. But in either case, he calculated the Earth to be about 75,000 years old. Now this is much younger than common estimates today, but in this day it was a pretty earth-shattering, pardon the pun, number, because a lot of people had thought that the Earth was very young. Only 4, 5, 6, 10,000 years old was more of a commonly held belief. So the idea that you would suggest the Earth was 75,000 years old would have been almost clear heresy. It would have been revolutionary, and in fact, a lot of people were up in arms about this calculation. But an old Earth is necessary, again, if one is to try and claim that the diversity of species and the things that we see, the landscape of our Earth, is created at the same pace of that we witness now on the normal day to day, right? That's called the uniformitarianism idea, that the slow and steady process that changes landscapes today is also what has been responsible for changing the entire Earth's landscape throughout the entire Earth's history. And because we see very, very slow, gradual, small changes today, it would have to take a lot of time for that very slow process to make such substantial changes to the Earth's landscape. He published his data here in this journal, which I don't speak French, so I'm not even going to try and pronounce that. We can divide people into two different camps of thought here when discussing how old the Earth is. There's the old Earth camp, and there's the young Earth camp. And old Earth camp would be atheists would be in this camp, generally speaking. And this would be a notion that speciation is what has given rise to all of the diversity of species that we see, and it was unwilled. There was no mind behind it. There was no intentionality behind it. It was just a random series of events that has no rhyme or reason behind it, that nobody wrote the laws of physics. There was no intentionality between designing the qualities and the properties of matter and the ways and the laws that would govern them. They just randomly came to be. Okay, that would be unwilled speciation. Somebody could also be in a camp that thinks something more like willed speciation. So perhaps the churnings of microevolution did produce all the diversity of species that we see on the planet, but it was willed. There was a mind behind it. The laws of physics were written specifically in such a way that it would cause the species to arrive at their appointed times. That it isn't random. Even though it might seem random, it's not. There's an intentionality behind it. This would be a notion known as theistic evolution. And for a long time, and probably still today, people make the mistake of miscategorizing evolution as something that's mutually exclusive to creation. So you maybe have heard before people have creation versus evolution debates. But that's incorrect. In fact, if I was a theistic evolutionist and I really believed that God had in mind all of the species that he wanted to create and set the laws of physics and design the properties of matter and accordingly, and then basically hit the start button and it all started to unfold. I mean, think about the forethought there. Think about, you would literally have to know where every atom would have to be accounted for in that calculation. You'd have to know where every atom lands, how it will collide with another atom, and how all of matter and all of existence will occur throughout time to create the intended species that you had in mind. I mean, that takes more forethought and more omniscience than I can even possibly hope to imagine. Okay, so it's not, that would be one of the most even spectacular ways probably to create something, because of the fact that it does require so much forethought and of foreknowledge of what is going to occur. Someone could also be an old Earth creationist, and that would basically be somebody who believes in a literal 6-day creation, probably, that the species were created directly by God, not through the means of speciation, not through the means of the churnings of microevolution, but just by the sheer power of God in a short moment of time, likely a day. And then once the whole world was created, then it went along its merry way, but it's much older than we think. Okay, so the genealogies in Genesis aren't quite historical. They're not historically accurate. They don't depict the actual timeline of the Earth. Then somebody could be a young Earth creationist, and this is often given the name, again, I think it's a mischaracterization to call it creationism, because, again, this is no less a creative event than this. But in either case, a young Earth creationist would believe that the Earth is not nearly as old and that all of the species were created, not through speciation, but just by the sheer momentary outspoken word of the Creator, and it only took 6 days to create the entire universe. All right, if you're an old Earth person, you probably believe that the universe is about 4.6 billion years old. Maybe an old Earth creationist might think it's not quite that old. A young Earth creationist would believe that the Earth is about 6,000 to 10,000 years old. So you can see this is like a pretty huge gap here. Like, you know, somebody is going home disappointed on this, right? Like, the Earth is either 4.6 billion years old or it's 6,000 years old. Like, that is quite a discrepancy. So and here we then progress. We descend into the controversy, into the contention, because there's not a lot of middle ground here when you have these types of extremes. Okay, so we're going to take a little time here and look at some of the evidence for both of the positions. By no means is this exhaustive. There is just an immeasurable amount of nooks and crannies one could go in this debate, and lots of different facets, lots of different pieces of evidence. So I'm just highlighting a couple of them to sort of cultivate an appetite, so to speak. But it's your job to take it upon yourself and investigate the different points and counterpoints for yourself. Okay, the evidence for an old Earth, here's some of the things that come to mind here. Generally, it's going to revolve heavily around geology and fossils, though that's not always the case. There's also some claims for an old Earth that can be made through genetics and things, but a lot of the debate usually centers around geology and fossils. And before we can talk about the relevance then of that evidence, we do have to have a little refresher here on what actually a fossil is. A fossil is basically a snapshot in history of a thing that once lived and no longer is living on the Earth. There's a couple different ways that they're formed. One is permineralization, and what happens in this type of fossilization is that some organism is covered with a bunch of mud, usually, and groundwater seeps into there, and some of the minerals in the groundwater, whether it be calcium or other types of particles, they come out of solution, they precipitate out of solution, and it fills sort of the empty voids of the organism with these crystals, and the crystals are able to outlast all the other soft tissue. So the soft tissue will erode away over time, but the crystalline structures are intact. A lot of petrification is of this type, so petrified wood. Wood has lots of porous spaces in it, because wood, tree trunks have like all these little tubes that run up and down that carry water and sugar and stuff up and down through the trunk. And so if it gets covered with mud and water is poured in, then the crystals can come out of solution and fill those empty spaces and preserve it. Okay, another way that could form is that mud, again, covers the mud or sand or something like that, covers the organism. Over time, then, the organism dies and decomposes, but the substance that covered it, because it was pressed down so hard, and because maybe it was like mud that then dried and it made kind of like a stronger substance that could withstand pressure, over time the contents then dissolved away or decomposed, and then other stuff then filled into that void and made not only a replica of the organism, of its shape, but then also the area around it leaves an imprint of the organism. So this would be called the cast fossil. It's not actually the original material of the thing, but it still shows the shape and the structures of it. And then the mold would be the hard thing that surrounded the cast. Okay, there are trace fossils. So these would be fossils that show traces of an organism. A good example of this would be in the Paluxy River Basin in Glen Rose, Texas. This was a site of a lot of interest because what happened is in the Paluxy River Basin it frequently floods, and when it floods, a whole bunch of clay and mud and stuff overflow the bank in just a short amount of time, and then the waters then recede, and then it bakes, that mud bakes, it becomes hard, and in theory it can preserve something underneath the surface. And so some people were out and about and they discovered that there was a whole bunch of dinosaur tracks along the river basin. So in essence, what must have happened is that at some point there was a dinosaur that came across here and left these tracks, and then shortly thereafter it probably dried, so the mud was really, really hard, and then the banks over flooded, and very quickly a whole bunch of silt or clay, muddy type stuff covered over this, and then dried and hardened again to preserve this this area from being eroded. Okay. Now, this is interesting. It shows a nice example of trace fossils, but it's also really interesting because it was thought, there was a push for the notion that there were actually human footprints found alongside the dinosaur footprints. And so you can imagine that that would be a pretty controversial finding, right? To find a human footprint and a dinosaur footprint on the same surface right next to each other, that would just bust wide open the idea of an old Earth, because according to an old Earth, there was a gradual speciation that happened, and by the time that humans were walking around, dinosaurs were long gone. They were extinct. Okay, so this was a big point of controversy, and this is one of those things where it's hard for me to really know how legitimate it is. For example, there's another picture here that I was coming across that shows a human-like footprint, and within 1 year, all the prints that were human had completely eroded. Now, this kind of strikes me as a little hoaxy, right? Because if literally there were human footprints found in a river basin, I mean, you would build a bunker over that. That would be like the most extraordinary finding ever. You would never just let it sit out in the open and let water just erode it. So I find it convenient here that that these tracks simply eroded away. That seems very suspicious to me. All right, but in either case, trace fossil would be one that shows some of the activity, the traces of an organism, not necessarily the organism's body. Okay, amber, what happens here is that a viscous substance like sap or honey covers the organism, and then it solidifies, it hardens, and then that forms like a protective casing around the organism to keep it from further decomposing. And then lastly, there are just some fossils that are literally still preserved remains of the original organism. So for example, they just found a while ago some soft tissue in a 75 million year old dinosaur bone. Now, what probably happened here is this is collagen, and the collagen is found inside of your bone. It's what makes your bones less brittle. So that is a particular soft tissue that was crystallized. It was full of crystals wrapping around it, and so it was probably the crystals there that preserved it and kept it from decomposing. Not unlike what's going on here with the amber. Okay, a couple of premises here for fossil evidence to ever be used for an old Earth. One, superposition, which basically states that the oldest layers of rock that fossils can be found are at the bottom, and we get newer and newer and newer and newer and newer and newer and newer as we go up towards the top. That layers are always being deposited on top of one another, so that we can then know that the ones on the top are the youngest and the ones at the bottom are the oldest. Now, this isn't always the way that layers of sediment are deposited. I wish I could find it. I found a video one time. I was watching a video of this British guy who was in some lab where they had like a chute, and they had water gushing through the chute, and there was sediment on there. And as the water sort of tumbled and turned, it deposited all at once layers of sediment as it swept across laterally. So there was stratification of layers formed simultaneously, basically, as the water flowed across. Now, if I ever can find that, I'll try and record it and keep it a snapshot in history. But I think I remember them saying that the bay outside of Naples, Italy, was formed somewhat like this fashion. Again, don't quote me on that. I can't recall the evidence, but that would be an instance where layers are deposited all at once, which would counter the idea of superposition. That not always is it the case that newer layers are found on top and older layers on bottom. Okay, also, if fossil evidence is to be persuasive for an old Earth notion, we should expect that there would be more and more developed forms as we progress through the layers. Not to say that some of these simple ones don't also find their way into the younger layers of rock, but we should see more and more forms arising as the process of speciation is underway, and it's working to create more ever more diverse array of organisms. So if one was to use fossils for evidence for an old Earth, they would better be sure about this, and they'd better be sure about this. Okay, now I'm not going to say one way or another whether I think that the fossil record shows these two. That's for you to determine. So how is it, you might ask, that a rock is dated? How do we determine the age of a rock? Well, there are a couple different ways. One's known as radiometric dating, the other one's relative dating. Radiometric dating would always have to be used first, and then relative dating would be used off of the findings of radiometric dating. And radiometric dating, there's a couple different types. There's carbon-14 and carbon-12. There's potassium, argon, argon, uranium, lead, so on, so forth. They all differ. You don't have to know the specifics of all these types, but they all differ in their half-life of decay. So generally how it works is that there's some type of atom that is unstable, and it decays at a known rate. And then by comparing the amount of that particular atom with the amount of another type of atom that remains more constant, scientists are able to figure out roughly how old the item is based upon how little there is remaining of the original unstable element. Okay, this is it's a little complicated to describe. So here, a picture says 1,000 words here. I won't show all of those different types of dating. I'll just show carbon dating, since carbon dating is usually more relevant for fossils. Carbon dating is used for younger stuff rather than really old rocks that are supposedly millions of years old. Carbon dating would be used for something that's like less than 100 or 50,000 years old, in theory. So without further ado, here's a little illustration of the process of carbon dating.
How do we know how old something is? For people, we'd ask to see their birth certificate. For trees, we'd count the rings. But how do we know how old a fossil is? Fossils have their own internal clock. Scientists can read it by looking at the ratio of two different types of carbon atoms. Of course, every living thing is made of carbon. Plants grab carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and use it to form complex organic molecules. Animals get their carbon by eating these plants. But there's more than one form of carbon. Most carbon atoms have 6 protons and 6 neutrons. We call this carbon-12. High up in the atmosphere, sometimes cosmic rays hit nitrogen atoms. This creates carbon with 6 protons and 8 neutrons. We call this carbon-14. Carbon-12 and carbon-14 behave alike, but carbon-14 has one unique and important attribute. It's unstable. So once an animal dies, the carbon-14 in its body will start to go away. Every 5,730 years on average, about half of the carbon-14 atoms will decay into nitrogen. This is its half-life. After one half-life, the animal will have about half the amount of carbon-14 it started with. After another half-life, it will have about a quarter. And after another half-life, it will have about an eighth. By contrast, the amount of carbon-12 it has in its body will stay the same. By measuring the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12, we can measure how many thousands of years have passed since the animal died. Carbon dating works for fossils up to about 60,000 years old. For older fossils, scientists use unstable elements that have much longer half-lives.
All right, now it's important that you understand that there are a few assumptions being made here with radiometric dating. One, that the prehistoric conditions in which the organism that yielded the fossil lived are the same as they are now. So, for example, they show this chart, right, and they show that originally there was this amount of carbon-12 and there was this amount of carbon-12. Well, this is determined based upon how it is now. If carbon-12 was more like, or sorry, if carbon-14 was more like here, and this was the ratio between them starting off, then it would totally skew everything off. Okay, so that's a pretty big assumption that the amount of carbon-12 and carbon-14 were the same, many, many, many years ago as it is currently now. In fact, even a lot of the people that would advocate for the effects, the devastating effects of CO2 emissions on the climate, would say that the amount of carbon-12, the ratio is altered because fossil fuels yield a certain type of carbon, and so there's much more of it now than there ever was before. So there's a lot of, it's making it much more difficult to use carbon dating essentially because of that. And that's just in the last 200 years. And if you look back in the cycles of history, there's lots of times where there was big explosions of CO2 into the atmosphere. That's at least what people are determining from ice core data. So that's a pretty big assumption that carbon-14 has always been the same proportion to carbon-12. Another assumption then is that depth does not affect the decay rate. This is where I'm going to propose 1,000,000 bonus points. Okay, if you do this experiment, I'll give you 1,000,000 bonus points. What I've always wondered is there any effect of the pressure or the radioactivity or the electromagnetism of being closer to the core? Is there any effect that depth has on accelerating decay rates? So to figure that out, what you'd have to do is you'd have to get a tunnel machine, and you'd have to bore a tunnel through something like the Grand Canyon, and then you'd have to also go way up here and get a drill bit for a well drilling bit, and drill all the way down, take out all of the contents that you drilled, put them in a big pool, and mix them up into a nice slurry. Okay, then right down at the bottom here, you would lower in a little treasure trove of fossils, or like just different organisms like apple cores or animal remains or what have you, just a whole smattering of different things. Then take that whole slurry from all the bits that you've removed from the earth, mix it up with water, get yourself a nice giant funnel, pour all of those contents back into the hole. You'd probably have to anchor these down so they don't move as soon as the contents come down into the hole. And as those contents fill the hole, it would be very interesting to see if the sediment separates out into layers similar to the original layers. Somebody who's a young Earth, they're also committed to flood geology, basically saying that the thing that's caused all the really significant landscape changes on our planet was the global flood. That with a global flood and the different catastrophes like that, big changes can happen in a small amount of time, which nobody would dispute that. I mean, Mount St. Helens is a prime example of that. But the young Earth proponent would say that it's the global flood and similar catastrophes which have created a lion's share of the formations that we see in our landscape today, not just a small exception here and there. All right, well, in either case, it would be interesting then to see if all of that sediment separates out into layers, and then, if this has a pretty high column of water on it to simulate a really high level of water in a flood, how that would compact the sediment. And then just let it sit for 50 years. After 50 years, also you'd have to put a little cache here of stuff on the surface to be preserved. After 50 years, dig your tunnel a little deeper, extract these fossils, take these fossils, date the two of them. Is there any difference here in the age? It's an interesting question. We would know that these are closer to the core of the Earth. We know these are probably closer to more radioactive elements in the Earth. There's actually, if you were to live in a brick house, there is more radiation emitted if you live in a brick house than there is if you don't live in a brick house. Bricks, even something as simple as brick, is radioactive, albeit in a very small dose. But the point is that there is radioactive minerals and material in the Earth, and maybe that the closer down you get, the more abundant they are. And so does that accelerate decay above and beyond? Does the extra gravitational pull accelerate decay? I don't know, but it'd be an interesting experiment nonetheless. So 1 million bonus points if you can pull it off. Email me your results. Okay, so that's the evidence for an old Earth. Now let's turn our attention to some evidence for a young Earth. Again, by no means an extensive, exhaustive list of evidence, just a couple of pieces here to get you thinking. Evidence for a young Earth, the ones that come right to my mind straight away would be, well, geology and fossils. So how mind-numbing is this controversy, right? You have geology and fossils being used as evidence for an old Earth, and also then right around the next bend being used as evidence for a new Earth that should help to at least help to illustrate just how complicated this issue really is. All right, so one of the pieces of evidence here is just that very thing that I mentioned earlier, that there are soft tissues that are preserved. Soft tissues decompose, right? If something dies and it's in the ground, it's going to decompose, and the counterpoint there would be that what happens is that mud covers it, and then the mud dries out. But the thing about it is that fossils almost always require water, like the permineralization and the mold and cast. I mean, these are areas where there's mud, and where there's areas where there's mud, there's water, and if there's areas where there's water, there's decomposition. Usually water breaks stuff down, and it's hard to imagine a scenario in which, or at least it's hard for me to imagine a scenario in which there would be that much water for an amount of time that could create a fossil, but that amount of time would be short enough that it doesn't totally destroy the entire thing, so to speak. Like, if we're going to let water into the picture, it will likely decompose it. So the fact that there are soft tissue fossils found is a little bit perplexing. You know, I can imagine a situation where some of the hard, more difficult stuff that's not going to decompose could last and be preserved, but it's hard to imagine the soft tissue. And even furthermore, just the 75 million year old dinosaur bones, they found collagen fibers in there, like I mentioned earlier. And if you do some of the research here on collagen, I mean, some people are saying that the half-life of collagen is 60 to 70 days. Now, this is vascular collagen, so collagen in the blood vessels, and the collagen that they found here is likely probably osseous collagen fibers in the bones. But still, you know, when an organism dies and there's all those bacteria in its gut, and if you add water into the picture, you've got a whole host of microbes on the scene that are all anaerobic microbes. You've got a whole bunch of water in there. Well, water breaks stuff apart. It hydrolyzes organic molecules. So how on earth can a collagen fiber last against that type of conditions? They see here even the half-life is even shorter in cases of disease and injury. And I would say that dying and being covered by a bunch of mud is a pretty severe injury. So stuff would start to decompose maybe even faster. So that is a perplexing component, is just literally how are fossils preserved like that. It's difficult to comprehend when the very process that makes them requires water, and water is the very thing that deteriorates tissues. Okay, another point of evidence here is that if we go beneath the Precambrian, beneath this line here, this is called the Precambrian era. There's very, very, very few fossils of any kind. There are these things here called stromatolites, which are supposedly mats of cyanobacteria or other kinds of bacteria that were fossilized. There are these things, which I can't even pronounce this word, but they're basically supposed to be evidence of little small algae and protist type structures. And that's really pretty much it. Okay, you go just a short bit into the Cambrian, and boom, every major body plan for the big animal phyla, the chordata, the mollusks, all of these different phyla of the animal kingdom, the basic body plans are there. And so we go from nothing, and then just right over here, whoop, into another thing. And it's full of life, full of complex organisms. That's pretty perplexing. Okay, right? That's pretty perplexing. Okay, there are also some fossils which span through multiple layers of rock. And if this was the case, again, if each one of these layers are supposed to be millions of years old, how is it that you can have a fossil spanning multiple layers? Now, these are a little bit more rare, but people would say, even an old Earth person would say, well, this is an event where a whole bunch of stuff covered this rapidly. Maybe it was volcanic ash, or maybe a big mudslide. There would have to be a lot of material that was covered rapidly, and then that whole thing was formed. But interestingly, you know, it'd be interesting to date this rock and then date this rock and see if you get the same date for both of those samples. Okay. Also, just looking at the sedimentary layers. Sedimentary layers are a big thing that flood geologists will talk about, or young Earth creationists will also talk about. Here's an interesting snippet here that I thought I would play for you.
All right, so you wanted to come here because you see evidence of a young Earth because of what's here. What do you see?
Yes, well, the first thing we notice is the extent of these layers. It's like a stack of pancakes. For example, the red unit that goes all the way across our field of view, that's the Schnebly Hill Formation. And above that, you can see the first white unit is the Coconino Sandstone. And above that, you've got the Toorawheep, and at the horizon, you've got the Kaibab Limestone, which is the rim rock of the Grand Canyon. And, you know, here we are, 70 more miles from the Grand Canyon, and these layers are still here.
Yeah. It's almost hard to imagine the volume of material that represents.
Yes, take the Coconino Sandstone. We can trace it from here, right across New Mexico, Colorado, right over towards Kansas and Oklahoma, or even in Texas. We're talking at least 200,000 square miles for this one rock unit that's consistent for mile after mile after mile. That's not the scale that we see today with localized sedimentation. And to get it flat lying like this over such a large area, it's like you have to make your pancake all at once very rapidly. And so these layers show evidence of rapid sedimentation, the extent of these layers.
Well, Andrew, you were talking about that red formation, but that doesn't sound familiar to me.
No, that's the Schnebly Hill Formation. It's not in the Grand Canyon. In the Grand Canyon, we go from the Coconino into the Hermit Formation. There's that knife edge boundary, and there's no evidence of erosion there, which means that the Hermit Formation was rapidly deposited, and then immediately the Coconino was a deposit on top of it. But here, we've come 70 miles from the Grand Canyon, and we've got this Schnebly Hill Formation between the Coconino and the Hermit. And this Schnebly Hill Formation, 800 to 1,000 feet thick, over an area of 1,000 square miles, had to have been formed very rapidly. If that took millions of years, we ought to see millions of years of evidence of millions of years erosion back in the Grand Canyon at that same boundary. We don't. So that means that this Schnebly Hill Formation in this area had to form in a matter of hours. So it tells you that not only is there a lack of erosion, but there's no time between those boundaries. So the whole sequence of layers was very rapidly deposited.
Okay, just to summarize here, just in case you didn't quite catch that, the argument is basically if you go to the Grand Canyon, you have, and then 70 miles away from the Grand Canyon, there's one type of layer, and it's all uniform across. And then over time, another layer starts to form 70 miles away, which would suggest that erosion is happening. There's different conditions happening at local levels, which is starting to cause a change in the landscapes. That's about what we would expect as, you know, lakes grow and shrink and rivers carve canyons and that type of thing. It generally then gives rise to new landscapes. And then something unique happens. There's a sudden introduction of a new layer that spans from the Grand Canyon to the 7 miles away to a good portion of the entire continental U.S. Massive layer. So it seems odd that we would have this gradual change that's starting to occur 70 miles away and then getting bigger, and then all of a sudden, whoop, it all changes and it's all the same layer. So that would have to be, the old Earth advocate would have to have some sort of explanation for this, I would think, but this would have to mark some sort of super catastrophic event, because, I mean, that's a huge pancake, like it was saying, right? The entire the entire continental U.S., a big portion of it, it has this layer all of a sudden. So that, what type of event would cause such a uniform transition to this type of sandstone? Okay, an interesting point. And then lastly, I think a case could be made for young Earth just by looking at the traces of civilization. So one of the oldest forms of written language is cuneiform, which comes on the scene, interestingly, here about the same time that the Bible would say that Adam and Eve came into existence. So if you go back to that young Earth time span, it's about 4000 BC. So here, within a couple hundred years, now there's a written language. Written language is a super important tool for civilization, and civilization is a really important way for humans to survive, right? If we can work together, we don't all have to be gathering and hunting for our own stuff. We can start to arrange labor. We can start to form we can start to form different hierarchies of labor, where you have managers and laborers, and that usually heightens the ability for society to spend time in advancement and technology. Well, you can't have a civilization without a language. There has to be a written language, a way to have receipts, a way to have signs on the door, and all that type of stuff. And so, is it really reasonable to think that this, considered one of the very first languages, cuneiform, had eluded the mind of a human, which was supposedly as developed as we are, for many, many, many tens of thousands of years? You know, most people, depending on who you ask, would say that if we look at the theoretical ancestors to humans, they had a brain function and the power of a mind about the same as us for the last 50 to 500,000 years. So, in other words, people that are closest to humans that have had supposedly brains like ours are as young as 50,000 years old, or as old as 500,000 years old. Even if we took that young age, 50,000 years old, do you think that if there was a population of humans on the planet with minds like our own, that the written language would elude them for 47,000 years at least, and probably more like 400,000 years? That just doesn't seem right. You know, if you put a whole bunch of people in the woods somewhere, and you tell them to survive, and they never had a written language, they're going to figure out a written language pretty quick. I mean, written language is huge. It's a massive technological advancement. With a written language, you can have cities. With a written language, you can have transactions and receipts and all this type of stuff. So it seems to me that written language would elude, you know, our ancestors, quote unquote, for 50,000 years. That doesn't seem right to me. So that, you can make a case there just from looking at the basically archaeology and traces of human civilization. Okay, now if you want to learn more, young Earth creationists, I will say, are a bit of a dying breed. Again, it's something that I like the idea of, and I'd like to try and justify it when I can. And so I've actually subscribed to this publication from the Institute for Creation Research, and it's actually a pretty good publication. They do some scholarly, put out some scholarly stuff. You could go here to find more. If you want to find more research for an old Earth position, well, that's becoming more and more the popular position. So most textbooks will describe the nature of the universe using an old Earth perspective, and so it's not hard to go far to find some good resources there that would advocate for an old Earth. And we'll leave it at that. I'll let you do, from this point on, let you do some of your own research. Again, you likely won't find the clarification that you're looking for, but it is nonetheless very important, I think, to focus in on this topic before we get too far into all the other facets of evolution.